The cowboy waited for his mail-order bride, but an armed outlaw woman took her place. Arizona Territory, July, 1887. The sun burned high, and the dust rose heavy over the small frontier town as Sheriff Daniel Clay stood at the lonely wooden station. He had polished his boots twice that morning, fixed his hat just right, and even straightened the porch where he dreamed he would walk with his bride. The letters she had sent him carried promises of kindness, warmth, and a new beginning for a man who had known nothing but silence on the edge of the desert. For months he had imagined her stepping off that train, holding flowers, smiling as if she had always belonged in his life. But when the whistle screamed and the iron wheels slowed, destiny twisted its cruel hand. Instead of a gentle bride, a tall woman in black stepped down, her eyes fierce and her movements sharp. Beneath her coat, hidden but certain, rested the weight of a gun that would change everything. The train's smoke drifted across the dry sky as Daniel's eyes fixed on the stranger who had stepped onto the platform, her coat brushing against the wooden boards, and her hand hovering near the place where her weapon rested unseen. And in that instant, the sheriff who had spent so many years in quiet hope felt the weight of the desert pressing harder on his chest than ever before, because everything he had prepared for, the polished boots, the steady dreams, the promises written in tender words, now seemed to vanish like mirages under the blazing sun. Yet even as his heart cracked with confusion, he remembered the nights when the loneliness of the frontier had nearly broken him, when the silence of his cabin echoed too loudly, when he had stared into the horizon and begged for someone to share the burden of endless days. And it was that hunger for love that had carried him through every storm, pushing him to believe that a letter from a distant woman could rebuild the pieces of his soul. But now before him stood not a soft bride with gentle eyes, but a figure carved out of danger itself. And though fear should have taken hold, a strange pull rooted him to the ground, for there was something in her fierce gaze that stirred not only caution, but an ache he could not name, as if fate had chosen to mock him by giving him exactly what he had asked for, but in the shape of a test crueler than any outlaw or storm. And the wind swept across the station carrying the whispers of townsfolk who had gathered nearby, their murmurs feeding the tension that grew with every second. While Daniel's hands, steady from years of drawing a gun, now trembled slightly not from fear of death, but from the sudden knowledge that his future had shifted in ways he could neither control nor escape. And he thought of the porch he had cleaned, the meals he had planned, the letters he had folded neatly under his pillow, and each memory cut deeper because he had wanted a partner to heal the years of silence. Yet the universe had sent him a woman marked by fire and shadow. Still as she stood there, her jaw tight and her stance ready, he caught a glimmer of sorrow behind the steel, a fleeting glimpse that told him she was not simply a blade sharpened by violence, but a soul chased by storms of her own. And in that moment Daniel realized his hope was not destroyed but transformed, reshaped into something darker, heavier, but still alive. And though the path ahead carried danger and betrayal and choices that would tear at his heart, the sheriff felt the strange certainty that his search for belonging had not ended with disappointment, but had only begun with this outlaw whose very presence turned his world into a story written in blood, dust, and the fragile spark of longing. The heat pressed down like fire as the wheels of the train shrieked against the track, and Daniel's breath caught in his throat, the figure before him no longer a dream but a storm wrapped in black. Her steps heavy, deliberate, echoing through the hushed platform where every onlooker felt the chill of something unspoken, and when her gaze swept across the town it carried no warmth, only a coldness that made mothers clutch their children tighter and men shift nervously in their boots. For her presence was not of a woman arriving to build a home, but of a shadow carrying secrets sharper than steel. And though Daniel's badge glimmered faintly in the sunlight, he felt smaller than ever, as if his authority meant little before the storm in her eyes. Eyes that did not search for welcome or kindness, but scanned the horizon like a predator hunting for weakness, and the revolver hidden beneath her coat pressed against her form with the certainty of violence, whispering promises of chaos to anyone foolish enough to stand in her way. Yet beneath the hardened surface, Daniel caught an unguarded flicker, a trace of exhaustion, of a journey too long and too heavy, and in that fragile glimpse, his heart twisted for reasons he could not explain. But the crowd's whispers swelled, suspicion growing with every second, men muttering that she looked like trouble, women murmuring prayers under their breath. And in that thick air, Daniel understood that the moment had shifted the fate of the entire town, because whatever business she carried, it would not pass quietly. And still she moved closer, boots striking the boards like a drumbeat of warning, stopping only when the distance between them was thin enough for him to see the scars etched faintly across her skin, reminders of battles that had shaped her into something far beyond the delicate image of a bride he once imagined. And as he tried to steady his voice, the world around him seemed to fade, leaving only the raw tension between a lawman searching for love and a stranger carved from fire and sorrow. And though every instinct told him to reach for his gun, another voice deep within told him to wait, to listen, because sometimes the most dangerous stranger is also the one who carries the truth that can shatter or save a soul. And as the train's final smoke curled into the sky and the crowd held its breath, Daniel realized that this arrival was not just the beginning of trouble for his town, but the beginning of a choice that would bind his heart, his duty and his destiny to a woman who had already rewritten every dream he once dared to believe. Her boots halted with a sharp thud against the planks, and silence gripped the station as if the desert itself held its breath. Then her voice cut through the heat, low and fierce, calling Daniel's name not with tenderness but with the edge of a blade. And every syllable struck like a challenge hurled across a battlefield, forcing his hand toward the holster he had sworn to keep steady. Yet before he could speak, she shifted her coat and the truth revealed itself like lightning across the sky. For beneath the dark fabric glinted the steel of a revolver, and the stance of someone who had drawn it many times before. And as the crowd gasped in fear, the whispers turned to recognition. The stranger was not unknown but infamous. Her face carried on wanted posters across 3 territories. Her name whispered around saloon tables where men spoke of robberies and blood spilled on canyon trails. And though Daniel had never imagined his promised bride as a legend of violence, here she stood in flesh and bone, her eyes burning with vengeance rather than love. And still what chilled him most was not the weapon or the name, but the way she looked at him, not as a lawman to be feared, but as the very target of her journey. For in her stare lived a message heavier than any bullet, one that promised the past had caught up with him, and his heart thundered as he questioned whether this meeting was a twist of fate meant to test his soul, or a trap laid carefully to draw him into ruin. The station filled with the rustle of nervous townsfolk backing away, mothers pulling children close, men staring wide-eyed, yet no one dared move between them. For the storm belonged only to the sheriff and the outlaw woman, and the sun blazed down as if to brand the moment into memory. Daniel's hand twitched near his holster, but something in her trembling breath stopped him. For behind the hardened mask of revenge he caught the shadow of pain, the kind of wound that no wanted poster could explain. And even as danger circled like vultures overhead, he found himself fighting not only the urge to defend his town, but the deeper urge to uncover what curse had bound her path to his. And the space between them felt like the width of destiny itself, one step that could end in blood or in revelation. And when she finally spoke again, her words were sharp but cracked with sorrow, a warning that she had not come to marry, not come to build a home, but to deliver justice in a way only her hands could write. And as the platform shook beneath the weight of her declaration, Daniel felt the fragile line between duty and desire blur, knowing that whatever choice he made now would not only decide whether he lived or died, but whether his heart would betray the law he had sworn to protect. The platform quivered under the weight of silence until her voice cut once more, steady yet broken at the edges, and with each word she dropped the veil of myth that surrounded her, revealing pieces of a past carved by betrayal and loss, confessing not to the crowd but to Daniel alone, that she had once been a daughter of the same soil, raised with the same hopes, but stripped of everything by men who had taken her family, her land, and her name, leaving her no choice but to carve a path with bullets and fire. And as her story spilled into the dry air, the townsfolk froze, caught between pity and fear, while Daniel's chest tightened with a storm of emotion, for the outlaw standing before him was no simple criminal, but a soul scarred by injustice, running not just from the law but from the ghosts that clawed at her every step. And in that terrible moment he felt the pull of 2 worlds tearing him apart. Duty chained him to the badge on his chest, the oath to protect his town, yet loneliness gripped his heart with a cruel reminder that he too had lived years of emptiness, that he too had begged the horizon for something, someone to make the silence bearable. And now here stood a woman whose presence threatened everything yet awakened a fire he thought long dead. Their eyes locked in a clash deeper than steel, his hand brushing the handle of his revolver not to end her story, but to steady himself against the gravity of her truth. And she, fierce yet trembling, held her weapon close not in hatred, but in fear of a world that had never given her mercy. And as the hot wind coiled around them, it was no longer clear whether they were enemies or mirrors of one another. For the sheriff who had waited for love now faced it in its most dangerous form, and the outlaw who had sworn to trust no man found her voice faltering in front of the very lawman she should have despised. The crowd watched with bated breath, expecting the crack of gunfire, but what filled the air instead was a silence so heavy it felt like the earth itself had paused to see whether bullets or hearts would decide the fate of the 2 souls standing on the edge of ruin. And Daniel, his voice low but steady, finally spoke words not of authority but of raw honesty, admitting that he saw more than her crimes, that he saw a woman who had been forced into darkness and still carried a light that refused to die, and as her hand trembled on the revolver's grip, her eyes softened for the briefest of moments. A fragile spark that hinted at trust, yet the sound of distant hoofbeats broke the stillness, a reminder that time was running short. Hunters were already closing in, and the clash of hearts would soon become a clash of guns that neither of them could escape. The thunder of hoofbeats grew closer as the sun bled into the horizon, and Daniel's breath weighed heavy, his hand hovering between justice and surrender. Yet when the riders appeared in a cloud of dust with rifles raised, he stepped in front of her, not as a sheriff bound by law, but as a man who had chosen to shield a broken soul. And in that moment, the badge on his chest meant less than the fire in his heart. For he knew the world would brand him a traitor, but his conscience whispered that he was finally alive. And when the outlaws thundered forward, his revolver barked against the dying light, steel clashing with fate, each shot not only a defense of her life but a vow that her past would not claim her future. And when the dust settled, she looked at him with eyes no longer hardened by revenge but softened by disbelief. And in that fragile silence, Daniel realized the choice he had made was not between duty and betrayal, but between emptiness and meaning. And he had chosen meaning, even if it cost him everything.